Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another week of the Better Events Podcast. This is Mary Davidson, one of your co-hosts. And in today's episode, you are going to hear from the one, the only Logan Clements, fellow co-host of the Better Events Podcast. She is going to talk all about Zoom tips for your next webinar or virtual event. Now, this is still an applicable topic, so stick with us. Logan has some really great tips and tricks to share with you. So let's get into the episode.
Welcome to the Better Events Podcast. Join two event strategists, Logan Clements and Mary Davidson, who believe we can all create, host, and attend better events. In this podcast, you will learn about event strategy and actions that you can use today as an event host, planner, or manager. Hear directly from the people who are creating innovative and inspiring events today and tomorrow, and grow your business along the way. Now, let's get started, and thanks for listening to the Better Events Podcast.
Hi, friends. Logan Clements here, one of your co-hosts with the Better Events Podcast. Thank you, Mary, for your sweet introduction. This week, you are just going to be hearing from me. We do some of these solo episodes every so often here on the podcast because both Mary and I are active business owners and event planners and producers. So we are currently kind of between different gigs and travel and everything. So sometimes it's just easier for us to record on our own. And so you're going to hear from me this week, and you're going to hear from Mary on her own episode 2 weeks from now. And I feel like you guys, listeners, might have been able to guess what my topic would have been on. This is something that we're going to be talking about, Zoom, folks. And if you are like, Logan, I'm done. Zoom is over. We're back to in-person. Well, I'm here to share a couple hot takes about Zoom and give you some tips of how you can keep using Zoom at your next webinar or your virtual event, because it is a tool that we all unfortunately had to use during COVID for almost everything. And now it is still a tool that is sticking around. And I just get these questions a lot. So a little bit of context for why we're going to be talking about Zoom. I also have a YouTube channel. If you just search Logan Clements, I should pop up. And I started it during COVID as a way that I wanted to showcase my expertise to clients, just help answer questions that I'd been getting so I could send them just a nice video of my response versus having to respond time and time again. Well, during COVID, like I said, we all had to be on Zoom. And there were a lot of things I felt like I had to learn the hard way in Zoom, where I was learning how to use it for events. I mean, we did conferences, award shows, happy hours. I did an escape room experience in Zoom, you name it. And so we were really pushing Zoom to its limits. And there were certain functions I realized would either break it or not give me the result that I wanted. And I'd get frustrated because I would figure out how would I have known how to not break it? And I couldn't find any content or anything out there. So I started doing some videos about these Zoom features that I was learning or breaking, and then learning how not to break. And as the internet is such a weird place, the algorithm took off. I have a lot of folks who follow me there purely for my tips about Zoom. And while we were deep in COVID, I feel like I did a lot of Zoom tips. Now I kind of intersperse. It's about 2 videos about something non-Zoom related. 1 video about Zoom is kind of the cadence I go, because I do love Zoom, and that's what we're diving into with this episode. But if you listen to other episodes of the podcast, you know that we have knowledge on all other event things. So if you want to dive in, that's, again, where my context comes from. And I still am getting clients who are talking to me about this. So first hot take, and this was one I laughed with Mary about, is the question I feel like you see in a couple other event production circles: is Zoom dead? Well, folks, because I'm doing this episode, hopefully that answers your question. No, it is not dead. But I am seeing why this question even is relevant is because there are a lot of people who are sick of Zoom. They're done with virtual. They want to be in person. And that makes sense. About right now, I would say maybe 60 to 70% of my event work that I'm doing is in person, and about 30 to 40% is virtual. And not all of my virtual folks are choosing Zoom, but it is the most commonly chosen platform. So is Zoom dead for being the default for everything? Sure, but people are still using Zoom. One of the things that came out of COVID is our expectations as attendees at a virtual event have gotten higher. And so what I'm finding is I'm actually getting hired by folks who find me on YouTube, find me on the internet, to run their Zoom webinars. And what I say is there is a difference between you just running a webinar with 0 webinar experience and somebody who knows Zoom and the ins and outs on the back end helping produce your Zoom webinar. And these are things that you would notice as the organizer. I don't think attendees will notice all the time, but they will definitely notice when it's not run well. A well-run webinar, you shouldn't even have to think about the Zoom settings. And so to me, Zoom is not completely dead for that reason. I am also seeing my in-person clients are utilizing Zoom still to bring in some virtual speakers, whether that's people who got sick or had something come up that they couldn't travel, or we've all had travel challenges with flying recently in the last 6 months. So that's a good way, just having that setup that you can utilize Zoom. And my big thing of why I always say that Zoom ends up being the default for some of my clients is we've all used Zoom. We know where the mute button is. We know how to turn our camera on and off. We know where the chat is. So there's just some of those barriers that even though there's a new and hot virtual event platform out there, Zoom tends to be the default. And a trend I am seeing in like the virtual event space is you're seeing new platforms, and not at the same speed I feel like I was getting it 2 years ago, but there are still new platforms or acquisitions that are happening for the big platforms in this space, but they don't include the video formatting, meaning they're like a fancy, I call it like a picture frame. So they're a fancy picture frame, and the picture is Zoom or YouTube or some other streaming service. There isn't that many other people competing with them. And like Zoom has a lot of features that Teams have and Google Meets have, but I just haven't seen Google Meet seem to really still be leaning into like the meeting feature. And Teams I found is really great if your organization all uses Teams, then that's where I see them using Teams for webinars and things. But it's not as great for being like a customer, like an outside your organization facing, because Teams has some really like gatekeepy features that certain things, if you are not a part of an organization that pays for a Microsoft Teams, the Microsoft Office suite of tools, you don't get access to. Like you're stuck on the web browser. And Zoom has done a good job, I would say, of making sure that a lot of the features are available to you if you're an attendee at someone's event or meeting, whether you have a paid account or a free account. So the long-winded answer to your question, I guess, is Zoom dead? I would say no, it is not dead. It's just becoming a little more nuanced of how we use it, but it is a great tool for any event professional to at least understand some tips and tricks about it and have it in your back pocket. So another question I get is like, when do you need to use Zoom and when do you not use Zoom? Again, little nuance. There's no blanket answer for all of you to say, yes, Logan told me I should never use Zoom, so I will never use Zoom. Or Logan has said I have to use Zoom, so I must use it. And I'm sorry, listeners, it's not going to be the answer I give you. But a lot of the times what I'm seeing is Zoom is a really effective tool for video conferencing. And so using it if you have an event where you want people on screen, you want to utilize breakout features, it's very interactive. Zoom meeting is a great place for that. Zoom is also a great place for a webinar. So I'm just talking at you, and it's meant to be that I want you to ask me questions in the Q&A. It's about an hour long. I'm getting a lot of information. It's mainly educational or informational. That's like the focus of your event. Then Zoom webinar, so the Zoom tool is a helpful tool for that. Now, what I am seeing in coaching some of my clients for like nonprofit fundraising events or galas or dinners, any of that, where it's more, you might be having an in-person experience and you want people to feel celebratory and excited. I have found that's a little harder in Zoom these days. Again, we did award shows in Zoom when we were really all like sheltering in place at home. But now I found if it's a Zoom link and you think you're going in for something fun and you realize it's a Zoom link, it doesn't feel as fun. So if you are doing kind of what I call a one-way stream, if it's like, people speaking on stage, you have videos, all of that stuff, but you're just really talking at the people and it's meant to be fun, I would utilize a different tool. So this is where I would stream to Vimeo, I would stream to YouTube. I'm also doing this if you are doing a hybrid event, meaning you have an in-person event and you want to utilize the virtual aspect as well. Streaming to YouTube or Vimeo and having it embedded on like your event website is a great way to reach more folks. I really see this with my nonprofit people because they're just looking to raise more money, and it doesn't cost them $1 to have, any extra dollars to have 10 people watching versus 200. So it's just a great way to scale your event and potentially bring in some extra dollars. There is a cost associated with having everything set up to stream from like your event space. But I found, again, that scalability of it, it's the same cost usually for 10 people or for 200. And for that kind of thing, I think Zoom is just not the right fit because you don't have a need. There's no purpose to have people on screen if you're using Zoom meeting or in the chat or in like the Q&A features if it was Zoom webinar. And so having it something that's a little bit more shareable, I don't see Zoom being the fit for that. So to sum that up, Zoom is a great fit, I would say, if you're doing an interactive virtual workshop, webinar, educational, informational thing. But I would go away from Zoom and go to more of your standard kind of streaming platforms like YouTube and Vimeo if you're doing more of like a program, a luncheon, a dinner, a gala, that more formalized fundraising platform, because that's more entertaining. And my little bonus tip in there is I love if you use YouTube Live. And again, you're trying to make something fun and different, is folks can access it and watch it on their TVs if they have a smart TV that has access to YouTube. So that's just a fun way. So instead of all of us crowded around our laptops on a Zoom meeting or a Zoom webinar or even like a tablet, we can actually sit and watch on our TV, which is just a fun way. Again, I've had some folks who want to have that celebratory, joyous feel for their event, and that's where their streaming comes in. And again, if you haven't gone back and listened to episode 2 that we've done in this podcast, it's one of our top 5 of all time, is all about finding your why and your North Star. And you will find if you and I ever work together on an event that has a virtual component or involves Zoom, you're going to hear me ask you, like, what's your why? How do you measure success for this event? And that really helps me figure out what the right tool is for you, because there truly is no blanket answer. All right. So another Zoom tip for you is, and I get this all the time in my meetings with folks, is what is the difference between Zoom meeting and Zoom webinar? So a lot of us are going to use the terms meeting and webinar interchangeably, but specifically in the case for Zoom, there are 2 different kinds of software. There's Zoom meeting software and Zoom webinar. So if you're a free user in Zoom, you only get access to Zoom meeting. You don't even get access to Zoom webinar. Even if you're a paid user, most accounts default to just having Zoom meeting access. That's what I have all the time. And then I can upgrade or add webinars to my account for like a month-to-month basis. So the key differences between the two: Zoom meeting has more options as attendees. We are all more on equal footing. So if I send a Zoom link for my Zoom meeting, you all come in, we're all the same. We're all attendees, we're all on screen. Zoom webinar has a few more controls. And so it has an actual participant invitation link, and then it allows you to add speakers or panelists to your webinar. It also allows you to start a practice session, which is where you can let all your panelists in early and you guys are all in the Zoom webinar. But when an attendee is clicking on the link, it says, oh, the webinar hasn't started yet. So there's a little bit more of this hierarchy where you're going to have people who are panelists, have more access to features, can join your webinar early if you have practice session enabled. And then there's participants. It also gives you more control as the host. So in Zoom meeting, there is no way to hide the information of how many people are on your call. So if there are 10 people on your call, we all will see in the participant count 10 people. In Zoom webinar, there are controls where you can actually turn that off. So attendees will see that they're a participant. If you have the chat enabled, they'll see people in the chat, but they wouldn't know if there were 10 people there or 200. Again, the context for how I've been utilizing a lot of Zoom webinar this past year has been for marketing webinars, educational webinars, and also some virtual press conferences. Because again, it's a great tool to spread your message. If your goal is to get the message out and interact with as many people as possible, a webinar is a really accessible way to do that at a very low cost to you as the organizer. So that's Zoom webinar. Zoom webinar also does have a feature where you can do Zoom. You can have chat and Q&A, and you can turn that on and off and disable whatever you want for your attendees and your panelists. So again, just more control over what's happening versus in Zoom meeting, you can turn the chat off, but that's your only option. Chat is either on or off. So those are some of the key differences when you're talking about Zoom webinar and Zoom meeting. I find that we all use our terms interchangeably. So this is something I always talk about. Folks, you can host a webinar in Zoom meeting because you're just calling it a webinar, but the tech behind it is Zoom meeting, and vice versa. I've had people call, it's a meeting, but it's really a webinar. So really, this is the software behind. So Zoom webinars software, Zoom meeting software. And then the question is, how do you use Zoom for your in-person events? I kind of touched on this a little bit already, but this is where Zoom can be really helpful for you for bringing in virtual speakers. Again, to my earlier point, we all know how to use Zoom at this point, or at least 90% of the population who is tech savvy and has to be on their laptops a lot, they know how to use Zoom. And so it's a really easy way that you can have your presenter zoom in, you put Zoom on your big projector on your screen. Most tech teams, AV teams at any venue are going to know how to do this, at least in the basic sense. This, again, is something that I get hired and brought in to do, to just be the person who worries about the virtual. So I would highly recommend that you can use Zoom as a tool for helping bring in a speaker who can't make it, who maybe has a last minute emergency that they just can't travel, but they are still available. Or even a third way that I see some of my clients use it, and that's to bring in some experts that they couldn't afford to fly out for that 30-minute presentation, but they find that person is willing to just do a 30-minute presentation from the comfort of their home. And Zoom is a great tool to do that. So I have an education conference that I do for an association, and we have usually about 3 or 4 speakers who are planned virtual. The last couple of years, we've had to flex and say, oh, someone got sick or had something come up. Now we have 8 presenters virtual and about 15 people in person. And so that was just working with myself as a producer to kind of flow out exactly when that person's going to check in. So we make sure they're there early, and we can tech check them with some headphones on to make sure they sound good before we put them up on the big screen. But Zoom Meeting is a great tool for that. Those Zoom Pro accounts cost like $100 a year, maybe up to $150. So it's a really low cost for having something that's pretty cool for bringing people in. So how can you elevate your Zoom webinar? Now, I'm going to link to my YouTube channel. I have a video on so many things about Zoom. I have a whole playlist that I'm linking here. My Zoom 101 that I think has, I don't know how many videos, a lot of videos in it that dive into each of these topics so much. But just some basic things for you if you're hosting a Zoom webinar. Also, if you're just hosting a webinar on any platform, WebEx, I don't know. I mean, I honestly, Zoom is really what I see a lot of folks using these days. But here are my 3 keys for having a well-produced Zoom webinar. Your first one is going to be when you start the webinar, if you're not immediately going to start talking, have a title slide and some music playing. My most popular YouTube video, I think, of all time is how to play background music in Zoom. So again, look at that 101 playlist. You can find that video pretty easily. But playing some nice background music. So when I say background, I mean not really full volume, maybe 10, 15%, and having a slide up. Now, why do we do that? Because as folks log into your event, it's like the slide will say, oh yeah, I'm in the right place. I'm here for the Logan's Zoom webinar here. Okay, great. I see her title slide. And the music part is then they are hearing music. And so they're like, okay, good. My audio is working. If it's just a slide and no music, they might be worried that they're missing something. And you'll see messages in the chat that usually are like, I can't hear anything. So it's just one that you can get ahead of those 2 things. I also just I think music is really powerful. I do this in my Zoom meetings, like when I have a team call with people, because I just hate the silence of being like, we're waiting for folks to log on. And then we all sit there in silence. It's really awkward. It's like the equivalent if you're going to an in-person event and there's like a happy hour and you walk into the happy hour and it's dead silent. You instantly you can feel it probably now just thinking about it. I'm feeling it just I would just be like, oh, I'm so uncomfortable. And so you don't want to have that be your first impression for attendees at your webinar or whatever it is you're hosting. And so having some background music is a minimum, but also then I think a title slide is just really helpful so they know, they're in the right place, they're seeing the right thing. It's such an easy thing to do if you practice it once or twice to make sure you know the controls on your computer so you're actually showing the slide you want to be showing and you're actually playing the music into Zoom. But it's so simple and just such an elevated little touch for your event. I love it. Another one for your webinar is making sure you have that clear call to action for how you want attendees to interact with you. And so whether this is in Zoom webinar, you can control, do they have the chat on? Is it just the Q&A? And making sure that you as whoever is your host, your person on screen directing your content, lets attendees know what they need to do. Hey folks, I want to hear where you're joining us from in the chat. Or, hey folks, we're going to have time for Q&A at the end. If you have any questions throughout, please drop them in the Q&A feature here in Zoom, and we will get to them as soon as we can at the end. Making sure you're calling that out. I've had some folks that I am a part of it as the producer, and so I give some suggestions on the content. But again, my focus is mainly the production, and I find they get frustrated when they go, we didn't have any questions at the Q&A. And I'm sitting here going, did you tell people you were going to have a Q&A? Did you tell them that you wanted them to submit questions? So you want to over communicate almost in any pre-event emails, and then you can communicate it even during. I'd love to do it at the top. I just think that's a natural housekeeping moment, or you can put it somewhere in the middle, but it just takes time for people to think of questions or to think of what to say in the chat. And so the more that you telegraph, the better. And that's, again, a bonus of why I think Zoom is such a great tool for education and things like that, because it appeals to both extroverts and introverts. Your extrovert person in an in-person room is going to be the one asking the questions. They're raising their hand. They're going to ask all the time. The introverts, they might feel uncomfortable asking in front of everybody, or maybe it takes them an extra second to figure out the right words for what they want to say. And the cool part about Zoom or a virtual event, that chat function, it almost like evens the playing field for everybody because it lets you get your extroverts are going to say something, but it also gives time for your introverts to figure out what they want to say, to type it out, delete a couple letters before they hit send. So you're going to see some more of that interaction, but just not naturally. People aren't just going to automatically do that. You need to kind of invite them, tell them how you want them to interact for your event. My last one for a tip for your webinar is to make sure that you are spotlighting people. So Zoom naturally will follow your speaker view, which means it'll follow whoever's talking first. And then the next person who talks, if everybody else is quiet, it's going to jump over there. Now, you might have memories from like COVID times. If someone coughs, Zoom wasn't smart enough to know, oh, that's a cough, not a talk, and they would jump to the person coughing. So spotlighting is a tool that you can utilize in Zoom to control speaker view. And I use this a lot when I have a panel, multiple speakers, or multiple people having a fireside chat or a conversation, spotlighting them both at the same time. And this is just kind of a cool tool to use for kind of controlling who's on screen when. In Zoom webinar, you can actually, even if you're not being spotlit, you're actually hidden. So like my role, I always joke, I'm like the wizard behind the curtain, so you shouldn't see me. And if I'm not spotlit in Zoom webinar, the panelists can see me, but the attendees can't see me, which is really cool. But anytime I unmute, it is like then I'm the wizard behind the curtain. I'm the voice of God. Everyone can hear me talking, but the spotlighting lets me kind of hide my backstage team. Zoom meeting, it's not the case. Zoom meeting, everyone would be able to see me, even if I was camera off and everything, but I could still control the spotlight to control who they're focused on, but they would also be able to see myself and whoever else behind the scenes. So again, Zoom webinars sometimes a better fit too if you have any like VIPs, VVIPs who might be coming with a team and folks, and you really want to kind of hide that team. Zoom webinar is going to be a better fit for you than Zoom meeting. Some other fun things I love about Zoom is there are some fun features, especially if you're going to use Zoom webinar. They've made it a little more customizable for you these days. So now you don't just have to do a virtual background. They actually will let you change like the background of the entire webinar. So everywhere where you see normally black around your squares or your rectangles, you can actually brand that and make that certain colors or a different image. You're also able to put lower thirds like Mary and I have here on StreamYard. If you're watching us on YouTube, is what we utilize for recording our podcast. But Zoom webinar lets you do that where you can say your name and you have your headline or your title. You can put that there. And those colors are customizable, which is great. Font, not so much that I know of at this time, but you can do lower thirds, which I just think look a little more professional than the Zoom wording. And then just with screen sharing, I think, you can either do it the traditional screen share way, or I have a video about how to be sneaky if you don't have a ton of slides and you just have a few that you want to put up. You can actually kind of trick Zoom and use your virtual background as slides. And I love that. I also had my mom point out to me that you can do a fun screen share with you overlaid on the slides. And that is in the screen share function. I have to research that a little bit more just because I haven't had speakers who want to utilize that, because my big caveat is wherever you are as the person in the corner, you're going to cover any content. So you have to really build your slides knowing that you're going to have yourselves overlaid. But there's still just some fun little branding opportunities of how you can make the most out of Zoom webinar. So why do you need to keep caring about Zoom? And how can you keep caring about Zoom? I would say, again, Zoom is not going to be the best fit for everybody. It's not going to be the best fit for every single event, but it is a really nice tool. And it's one that I just want to see a lot more event pros, embrace and just continue to stay up to date on so they're aware of its functionalities. We know like accessibility is a big thing in the event industry. It's a buzzword, I guess I should say, but we don't see a lot of people actually putting their money where their mouth is because there is money associated with that added accessibility. And a cool thing with Zoom, it's got some built-in accessibility tools. It has built-in captioning that has only gotten better as we've embraced more AI tools and things. You can adjust the font size of those captions individually, as like on my device, I could have them really big, really small. You can drag them around. So there's automatic captioning in your webinars, which is just a really cool feature. You can also easily add, an ASL translator, or they have simultaneous translation just actually like built in where you just have to hire the translator and they have the tools already built in to allow there to be a separate audio channel for your, your Spanish speakers or your Chinese speakers or whatever to listen to your webinar. And so that's just something that I'm like, leave that in your back pocket. I wouldn't knock Zoom entirely. So I would just encourage you to keep caring about it. Again, my YouTube channel is a great resource where I'm constantly reevaluating and looking at new tools and updates and things coming out. And then my big thing for you would just be like every 6 months to make sure you've updated your Zoom. And the pro tip here is not just on your laptop, which is what I have mine set up to like automatically update on my laptop, which is great. But my bone to pick with Zoom is that I have to still manually update it, like go to my app store, hit update for my phone as well as my tablet. It doesn't automatically update across all of your devices. And that is a caveat. Some of these features that get rolled out in Zoom, like the background and the lower thirds, they will not be visible to any attendee who has not updated their Zoom. And so that's something I always put in my note before you goes. If we're utilizing Zoom, like make sure you've updated so you can make sure you can take advantage of all the latest features is really what it is. So that's a really big tip for you, I would say. And just make sure you don't forget about it, because I think not like a global pandemic is going to happen again, but it is just a useful tool. And I am getting a lot of business from people asking me for this stuff. So this is one that I constantly am looking for other people who are excited about Zoom and still staying up to date with it, because there is a business opportunity there. So listeners, if you're someone who's been paying attention to Zoom or you want to learn more, I do have like a Zoom producer class that you can take on demand that gives you more of like me running you through essentially a lot of what I cover on YouTube, but in a sequential order. Or you can look at my free videos on YouTube. My like biggest hits again tend to be that background music one, as well as talking about those key differences between Zoom meeting and Zoom webinar. I'll link to that one down here. But yeah, my biggest takeaway for you listeners, I would say about Zoom is it's not dead. Don't knock it. Don't feel like you have to be on Zoom all the time, but just know that there is still a need. There's still a business opportunity there. And I am seeing it still do a lot of good in this world. And so Zoom is not dead. And hopefully you learned a little bit about some tips and tricks about your next webinar in Zoom, which to me tends to be the biggest use case that I see for it. And then you're better educated on kind of the differences between Zoom meeting and Zoom webinar. Now, before I wrap up, I have our bonus tip this week, since you're just with me, dear listeners. And this week's bonus tip is to get yourself a label maker. This has been a highlight from my spring events, from labeling clipboards for my 50-person event team to using it to label envelopes of the hundreds of tickets that we gave away at a tournament. It has been super helpful and has saved my hand so much. The one that I use, I'm going to link here in the show notes. It's a Dymo Letra is what it is. I got it as a gift from a friend who was like, you're an event person, you probably need a label maker. And then it just wallowed in my office during COVID because I wasn't physically on site. But it has just been something that's been so helpful when I've been out there. I think it came in clutch for a couple of folks who weren't even on the event team, but in the logistics team who needed to label something. So I highly, highly recommend it, or your own label maker of your choice. You never know when you need something nicely printed on anything when you're on site. Well, that brings me to the end of this episode. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn at Better Events Pod. You can send us an email at bettereventspod@gmail.com. And you can connect with Mary and I directly on LinkedIn. We seriously love hearing from you guys, so keep that going. And as always, we thank you for listening, and we'll be back in your ears again next Wednesday.